I'm Annie Duke, and in this lesson, we're going to answer one of the burning questions in poker. To limp or not to limp? I mean, limping can be a very touchy subject for poker players. Some players like to limp so they can see cheap flops, especially when they're holding speculative hands, like suited connectors or small pairs. Other players believe you should never limp because by limping, you're inviting players into multi-way pots and limiting your chances to win the hand. While we tend to side with the more aggressive players, we certainly can't tell you that limping is never the right play. What we can tell you, though, is that it's not usually the best play. Let's start by looking at why players limp in the first place. As we've mentioned already, many players like to limp with speculative hands that they don't feel comfortable raising with pre-flop. In these cases, they're hoping to basically get lucky by hitting the flop hard and winning a big pot, or being able to let the hand go without costing themselves too much money. The problem is that players who like to limp with speculative hands are limping with a very specific set of hands, and essentially whenever they limp, they're letting the other players in the pot know something really significant about their hand, that they have something like suited connectors or small pairs. In other words, the limp is basically turning their cards face up to their opponents, which we really try not to do in poker. Another reason players will limp is to trap. The difference here is that instead of limping with a speculative hand, sort of trying to get lucky on the flop, players here are limping with a big hand like aces or kings and are hoping to win a big pot when they either flop a set or their overpair holds up and their opponents don't really put them on that. While there can be benefits to this play, certainly the downside often outweighs the reward. I mean, let's say you find aces in early position and decide to trap opponents by limping into the pot. Ideally, you're hoping for someone to raise behind you so that you can then re-raise and isolate them in a heads-up pot where you're likely to be a big favorite. This is problem number one with the limp. Because when you do re-raise your opponent, now it's really easy for them to fold a hand like, say, 2 nines or ace-jack. Whereas if you had just opened the pot for a raise with your aces, those hands like ace-jack or 2 nines would probably re-raise you, and then they could really go broke to you. Now, there's a second problem with this limp. What if nobody raises behind you? By limping with your aces, you're giving players behind you better odds to limp along with a wide variety of hands that have a potential to beat you after the flop. I mean, let's say 5 players see the flop, and the flop say 7 of spades, 9 of spades, 10 of clubs, after you've limped with your lovely 2 red aces. How likely do you think it is that your trap has now backfired when you're facing 4 opponents on a very draw-heavy board? How much more comfortable would you have been if you had just raised your hand pre-flop and were only facing 1 opponent in this situation? Not only can limping put you into uncomfortable post-flop situations, but it also takes away a potential for you to just go ahead and win the pot pre-flop. Remember, one of the goals of raising pre-flop is to thin the field of players with marginal hands who are looking to see cheap flops. If you don't raise, either with your premium hands or your speculative hands, you're removing a very important weapon from your poker arsenal. So is limping always wrong? No. There are times when it may pay to try to limp into the pot, but only under very specific circumstances. The first circumstance is, let's say that you're in a game where when you raise, you always get like 5 callers. Well, in that game, raising isn't doing too much for you, is it? If you raise, you're still getting 5 callers. So that's the kind of game where limping might make sense. Another place where limping might make sense is when you're playing at a table of very aggressive players, and you notice that every time you open for a pot, players are re-raising you, and they're re-raising you with pretty weak hands, or there's one player who's consistently punishing limpers by raising every hand, and it's making it very difficult for you to be able to play in this game. In this type of situation, you may want to limp in with a really big hand, like aces or kings, so that you can exploit and punish your opponent's over-aggressiveness by re-raising them when the action gets back to you after they've come after your limp. To make this play work, though, you have to be very confident that at least one player behind you will be willing to put in a pre-flop raise. If your table is too timid, you're only going to get yourself into trouble where you're going to find yourself playing like a 5-way pot with 2 aces, just as we discussed earlier in this lesson.